hopefully what I'll be able to do is take your questions and you can ask them directly to our panelists, and hopefully they will give you good answers. So get ready to put those questions in, but also be aware that this will be live streamed, so any questions you ask will be forever preserved on the internet. Without further ado, I'll introduce our panelists. So from the SMF, we have our Interim Research Director, Jamie Gollings, and Jamie is going to take you through the data-driven analysis that he's done on reform and the rise of populism in the UK. We also have Keiran Pedley, who is the Director of Politics at Ipsos. Keiran is a regular contributor on Twitter or X, where he has a good set of posts, which is a rare thing these days on the site that is X. But he has a great insight into politics and polls. And I'm sure he'll give us some interesting take on what's going to happen later this week in the local elections. And we also have Sascha O'Sullivan. Sascha is a journalist who's variously worked at The Sun, City AM, and The Australian, which you might notice from her accent if you've ever listened to her fantastic Westminster Insider podcast, which is surely one of the best podcasts in a crowded field, and is now at Politico. So welcome to Jamie, to Keiran, and to Sascha. The SMF is very interested in this topic of the rise of populism. We are a cross-party, centre-ground think tank. We're not aligned to any political party, but we do see lots of challenges with the rise of populism. We don't think that those people who are voting for parties like Reform are idiots or misled. We think that they've got reasonable concerns and very strong disaffection with the state of politics. And we think it makes it all the more important that those of us inside the Westminster Village are looking very clear-sightedly at what's driving the rise of populism. And so we've been doing some analysis on this, and Jamie's going to take you through that. So I'm going to hand over to Jamie to take you through the SMF's analysis.
Great, thanks, Theo. I'm just going to make sure this is all working okay. Great. So, top of the pops, populism in the UK and in Europe. Before we sort of go into sort of the analysis, I thought it'd be helpful to get everyone on the same page about kind of what we mean when we're talking about populism. It's one of those words, like big data 10 years ago, which get thrown around a lot and which people sort of struggle to define. So we dug around. This was a definition that we quite liked. So where populism is sort of a political creed, where it's got a big us versus them characteristic. So that might be about, anti-elite. We are the people, they are the elite. This could be about ethnicity, could be about religion, could be about income. So it's us versus them. There's sort of a majoritarian view of democracy. So this is kind of, we won the Brexit referendum, and therefore we can do whatever form of Brexit that we like, irrespective of the fact of sort of the closeness of the result ultimately. Or basically, if we win an election by 50% plus one vote, that means we can do whatever we like. We are the winners, and we don't have to try and find a kind of a balance across the populace. And then there's this kind of anti-institutional element, so that might be against parliament politics, but often against the judiciary, against the media, against these kinds of international organizations, the UN or whatever it might be, the European Court of Human Rights, and so just trying to sort of tear those things down. So those three things sort of combined sort of give you kind of what we'd see as populism. There's populism of the left, of the centre, and of the right. So on the left, there's sort of Mélenchon's party in Paris. There's Syriza in Greece. In the centre, you have the Five Star Movement in Italy. But on the right, I mean, that's clearly where the focus is. It's clearly kind of be a lot of what we're thinking about in this conversation today. You've got sort of the softer end, sort of Berlusconi's Forza Italia, but then you've got Reform in the UK, and then further off to the right, you've got the AfD. And it's those kinds of far right parties. This graph kind of charts sort of the vote share of populists in European elections since '93 to a couple of years ago, and that blue wedge is the other sort of the right wing populists, and that's where sort of hay is being made. So our approach was, I mean, we'll hear this from Keiran on this. There's obviously loads of polling that goes on, and there's great work. And we're not a pollster; we're a think tank. Policies are bread and butter, and so we wanted to look at this from a sort of a slightly different angle. So rather than just thinking about what the individual's telling us about why they're voting for these certain parties, and you can tell about, you can learn about what their personal characteristics are, what their worries are. We want to look at it as sort of in this sort of the policy context around them. So in those seats, what's happening? And we can look at things which, will map to the polling things, so about ethnicity or whatever it might be, but also things like what's happening in crime in their area, what's happening in housing in their area, those kinds of factors. And so that's the approach we've taken. So first challenge was to basically consume as much data as we could across sort of English constituencies. We focused on England to start with, across a whole range of things. So as I said, so crime, the economy, geography, health, and we threw those things together, and we looked at this in two ways. So the first way is basically, let's look at the top 20 reform seats and let's see what things they have in common. So this sort of six square thing will come a bit clearer as I go forward. But so if we look at, for example, the share of people with degrees in those seats, in that top 20 seats, this little mini chart sort of shows you that, okay, that those kind of purple bars show that they're basically clustered towards the lower rank end. So basically, these seats quite strongly in common basically have lower shares of people with degrees. On the other end, on the share of people that is white, they tend to cluster on the higher end of the spectrum, those top 20 seats. Slightly less sort of tightly clustered. If we look at average wages, sort of that bottom left chart, we can see that they tend to be towards the lower end of the average wage spectrum, but it's not quite as clear as with the people with degrees. That's sort of a feature they really have in common. And then on the other end, they tend to have a higher share of people with jobs in manufacturing, but again, it's not as tightly defined as with the proportion that's white. So in the middle, we have factors which these reform seats tend to be more sort of average in the sort of middle of the pack. So we see, reform voters are by and large on the older end of the population, but it isn't the case that seats that have a high share of older people are necessarily more reformy. We actually see that those top 20 seats actually kind of tend to be around the sort of the middle of the age spectrum. And then for rank growth, the sort of bottom middle chart, there's really no trend at all. So sort of not really a much of a link we can see between being a top 20 reform seat and having high or low rental growth. So that was kind of, what do we learn from the top 20 seats? If you want to see, go through these in more detail, you can find the report online on our website. But yeah, so that will sort of indicate a few of the things they have in common. The other thing we can do is use regression analysis. So this is a statistical technique that basically looks at sort of the strength of correlation. So on the left-hand side, we see these are all the sort of 500 or so seats in England. Each blob is one of those, and we sort of see a clear correlation. So the more people with degrees, the lower the reform vote share they achieved in the last general election. That's quite tightly correlated. The right-hand side, we're looking at that age data again, and we can see it's basically a big blob, it's a big pink blob, and sort of quite a few of the more highly performing reform seats tend to be in the sort of middle distribution, but there's much less clear correlation. So we can do that systematically we could do this individually for each of the kind of 70 odd variables that we had, or we want to kind of throw these things in a single model, use multiple regression analysis, and we can kind of try and sort of piece apart sort of which of these factors are more or less important. To do that, we can't throw all 73 variables in. Some of the variables are pretty similar to each other. So the proportion of people that is white relates very closely to the proportion of people that is black. We also saw a lot of people, for example, places that were whiter also tended to be older. So some of those variables are basically telling us the same information. We basically want to put variables into this multiple regression model that are kind of independent things, so they don't kind of confuse each other. So once we've done that, the model then spits out and tells us what are the really important factors for predicting the reform vote share. There's this tornado chart, which is a snazzy name, but each of these sort of numbers basically tells us how important it is. If it's a large negative number, like the proportion with a degree right at the top, that means that it's a very important factor, but it's sort of the larger the proportion of people with a degree, the lower the reform vote share. Whereas the second one down, the proportion that's white, That's again a large sort of absolute number, but it's positive. So the higher the proportion of people that are white, the higher the expected reform vote share. So those sort of proportion degree and proportion white are the two big sort of influencing factors. The next couple down, we've got crime level. So a higher crime level means a higher reform vote share, and the proportion and the change of people that are white. So this negative number here is basically telling us that a sort of the more that the share that people are white it falls, the higher the vote share we expect to see. So summarizing those, very important, people with degrees, large white population. Other important things, higher crime, shrinking white population, having more people on universal credit, cheaper housing, cheaper rents, a perhaps large but shrinking manufacturing sector, and leveling up, which was an interesting sort of slightly surprising finding. We found that it was quite a small coefficient in the model, but places that had more leveling up funding pledged tend to sort of the model thought that they would have expected them to have a lower vote share for reform. So this doesn't necessarily mean that it's the leveling up funding that kind of did that. It sort of made that happen. It could be that the way that the leveling up funding was allocated, it went to places that were maybe less likely to be high reform seats. But interesting hints nonetheless. And things that weren't so important, as we said, sort of older population, at least at the seat level, didn't seem to be such a big factor, and sort of things, sort of more economic measures like level of businesses per capita. So that entrepreneurialism wasn't necessarily a predictor of how reform did. So that kind of told us about what are the factors that sort of correlated with higher or lower reform vote share. The multiple regression also basically acts to build us essentially a prediction model of sorts, or at least it says, okay, what it learned from the general election in 2024, what those results told us about how that links to those data that we put into it. What then can we say about what we expect the reform vote share to have been if we were going to rerun that election? And so you kind of see this trend. The model's pretty good but not perfect. But that's where the interesting thing comes in. So where the model is missing things is where there are things that are not being counted for in the model. So this blue blob that we've highlighted down there, these are seats where the reform vote share was expected to be higher than it actually ended up being in 2024. So a lot of these seats from places like sort of around Liverpool, which maybe speaks to sort of a sort of more left-leaning political culture there. We also see a seat there like Peterborough, which sort of one explanation we received for that was that the Conservative candidate there was sort of particularly sort of had quite sort of reform-like lines, and so perhaps that sort of ended up eating into their vote share there. Then on the other side of the spectrum, we've got the places at the top of the chart, sort of Clacton, Ashfield, Boston, Skegness, Yarmouth. These are seats that were won by reform, and so basically, they're expected to do quite well. They're towards the right end of the chart. Which is sort of where the x-axis is what we expected reform to get, and the y-axis is how well they actually did. So they're kind of in that top right quadrant. So they're expected to do well, and they did even better than that. They're above the line. But there are other places in there, places like Rotherham, Macclesfield, which they didn't win, I don't think, but where they reform outperformed sort of what the model would have expected based upon those sort of bits of data we fed into it. There were some other sort of interesting sort of trends that we noticed. So places in the southwest, sort of almost all of the seats in the southwest, reform underperformed versus what we'd have expected based upon those fundamental data. Meanwhile, in the West Midlands, most of those West Midlands seats reform overperformed there versus what the model would have expected. In London, these sort of split London into kind of two sections. So the yellow blobs are inner London, and the green blobs are outer London. So a lot of those inner London seats were predicted really, really low reform vote share. So we had some that even the model predicted like negative reform vote shares, which is quite strange. But nowhere really dropped below sort of 5-ish% for reform. So even though the model expected that to be next to zero, there was sort of a bit of a flaw in reform's vote. And then looking out of London, there are some of those seats at places like Hornchurch and Upminster, Dagenham and Rainford, Bexleyheath and Crayford, places where reform outperformed the model. So areas you sort of, as a think tank, we did this to kind of explore the problem, and there's more analysis that we'll do using that data. But there are sort of big themes, sort of big policy themes that we want to sort of dive in further to understand those trends. So One of those is the education level. So clearly that sort of proportion of people with degrees was key. But what is it that's driving that? Is it that the university is a liberalizing experience? Is it that the people who go to university have a different people who end up with graduate jobs end up having a different life to people without graduate jobs, and it's that trajectory which pushes some to reform or not others? Or is there something about the kind of non-graduate jobs worsening relative to graduate jobs these days, or the composition of those things changing? So education level is really important. Clearly, sort of having a large fall in white population was a big predictor of reform strength, and so issues like immigration, but also sort of community cohesion and integration, areas to explore. Economic factors, so falling manufacturing employment, not much important, things that weren't important, such as sort of business per capita. Understanding how economic growth actually sort of translates to how people feel and how communities experience that growth is important. The kind of classic quote of that's not my GDP, it's yours. How to make people actually feel growth, if that's what the government's pushing for. And crime rates as well, being important. But we wanted to do some more analysis, understanding which particular types of crime sort of most translate to the reform support. So those are the slides. As I said, there's plenty more sort of detail of that online. Yeah, everything. That's a bit of a quick whistle stop tour from me.
Thanks, Jamie. Thanks for the whistle stop tour. Lots of data and analysis in there. And I think what makes this data different to lots of the polling that we've seen is that this is not driven by polling. This is looking at what are the correlations between government and ONS data and those places where reform have done well. And some really interesting things it tells us about reform, which is the key determinant of all of the other statistics, is low skill, no skill workers. It is an indicator that white communities with falling white populations are more likely to vote reform, and that certain parts of the country, such as West Midlands and some of those old red wall seats, are more susceptible to reform where they're outperforming, whereas others are more resistant, like the Southwest and Liverpool. So some really interesting data there. Keiran, in your analysis, when you are looking at sort of opinion polls and focus groups, is what we're seeing here, is this consistent with your analysis of where reform are rising and where the support for reform is strong?
Yeah, I think the education cleavage, if we can call it that, in politics has been very clear in our post-election how Britain voted analysis that we do after every general election. So after every general election, Ipsos produces a large-scale poll of around 15,000 people, which is weighted towards the result to try and understand who voted for which party and what the key trends are. And this gap between graduates and non-graduates that Jamie led made very clear in that excellent presentation is something that we see very, very strongly.
And what about the geographical differences? Are those that you're seeing showing up? I think it's interesting that we see this sort of in the model that we've developed. We see a big difference in the Southwest and Liverpool, where reforms seem to struggle a bit more, whereas places like the West Midlands, where they're outperforming. Is that something that you see as well on the polling side?
Yes, I think that ultimately we know that politics can be hyper-regional, if we can use that phrase, within the UK, and so the core of where support for Reform UK seems to spike does tend to be in the Midlands and sort of East Midlands as well, but also there's sizable support in the north of England. The Southwest, as you identify, has that sort of tradition of a sort of Liberal Democrat versus a Conservative battleground. I think that's going to be harder for Reform UK to break through there. I think another place that we should consider when we're talking about reform is Wales. People, I'm sure, on this call will know that, on this webinar will know that that was actually where reform got their highest vote share proportionally at the general election, and they're targeting that very heavily ahead of the elections in Wales next year. So I think that you're clearly there's a strong regional variation in support for reform. But what I think underpins this to a large degree is just a general dissatisfaction with the state of things in Britain. the last general election was very much, as we call it, a change election. Almost 8 in 10 members of the public told Ipsos before that election it was time for change. But our data also shows there's intense public dissatisfaction with the pace of that change. Now, Labour would obviously say less than a year into office that that may be to be expected. There's going to be something of a lag time. But all of the data that we have available so far shows that around half of the public are disappointed with how Labour have done in office so far. Clear majorities dissatisfied with how they're handling key issues like immigration, which is obviously a big issue for reform, but also the cost of living and the economy more generally too. So I think that when we're looking ahead, where reform support might grow geographically is important, but there is the macro picture of where their overall vote share is. The higher that goes, stands to reason, the better they're going to do in the future in terms of country level elections, but also general elections too.
And do you think this reform vote is significantly different to the support that we've seen in the past for Farage-led parties?
Shares many similarities, and I think Jamie sort of identified some of those around education. And I mean, age is still a factor, I think. I mean, it may not be at an individual seat level, but certainly, the core of Reform UK's vote, at least at the general election, was older men without a degree. But I think that what feels different at the moment is the scale of it, or at least the size of it. At the moment in the opinion polls, Reform is somewhere in the mid-20s. They've never, whether it's Reform UK or the Brexit Party or UKIP, they've never registered that as an individual political parties in past elections. One can talk about the Brexit vote itself as obviously a much larger number. But I think that what's important to digest for anyone thinking about Nigel Farage and Reform UK is that whilst the core of their support undoubtedly comes from former Conservative voters, there are differences in how Reform UK voters think about politics and think about the world to quote unquote your traditional sort of true blue Tory, much more inclined towards economic populism, and much more inclined to think that the system is just completely broken. And I think one of the key messages you're going to hear a lot of in the next week or so with the local elections, but sort of moving forward, is this idea of the uni party and all the main political parties being the same. That is the core message Reform has that probably is in its favour at the moment, that the sort of so-called established parties have failed you. But there are doubts about Reform UK as well. So when we ask the public what are the key barriers or what are the key doubts you have about Nigel Farage specifically as Prime Minister, two stand out outside of his closeness to Donald Trump, which may be a temporary thing. The next general election may be under a different US president. But the two that stand out are the idea that Nigel Farage is too divisive to be Prime Minister, but also that Reform UK don't have sufficient talent in their ranks to form a competent government. So even with populism and even with a party like Reform UK that has the issue of immigration and the general dissatisfaction with the established parties in its favour, the public still want to see that or feel reassured about that idea of competence and having an agenda that will actually work. And as I say, in an environment where people are very sceptical about the future of the country and how it's governed, that's still going to be a challenge for Reform UK, just as it is everybody else.
Thanks, Keiran. Sascha, coming to you, how do you think this is playing out in Westminster and in your conversations with MPs? How seriously are they taking this risk of reform, and is there panic on all of the benches?
So I think, first of all, thanks for having me. I think it's a really interesting thing for us to be talking about. Is there panic on all of the benches? Yes and no. And I think one of the things that's very important when we talk about the kind of threat of reform is to actually think about this. It's very easy to think about it in terms of local elections, in terms of by-elections, in terms of the next general election. I think what's more interesting at the moment, given how far off we are from a general election, is to think about it in terms of where actually is it pushing politicians? Where is it making them change their policies? So and I think on the top level, we have how are the mainstream parties dealing with this on their kind of national messaging? How are the Conservatives responding? We had, a couple of people saying maybe the Conservatives need to consider a pact with reform. How is Labour responding in terms of going further to the right on immigration? And how does that either keep some of their MPs happy who have big reform contingents in their seats and are therefore worried about this, versus some of the MPs on the left who are saying, you know what, this isn't Labour policies and this is not what I got into government for. I mean, this morning, just a couple of days out of the local elections, we had Yvette Cooper talking about cracking down on sexual offenders claiming asylum in the UK. I suspect a lot of the people who would have been voting reform would have thought, hang on, weren't we doing that already? But I do think that that's one of the things that is where this conversation is based in Westminster at the moment, in terms of where is it pushing the national parties to actually change their own positions, because they know that this threat of reform is a couple of years down the line. And then I think you have it on a more local basis, where you do have individual MPs who are really, really, what I was about to say, quite worried about reform in the seats. They're really worried about reform in their seats. And they're trying to do a host of things, and it kind of depends where you go. If you go, you know, somewhere like Makerfield, for example, there's a lot of concerns about road infrastructure. You've got Josh Simons out there who's you know, doing a whole thing about roads, and he it's one of his things is he thinks that sense of connectedness means that his voters feel very left out, and they actually don't have that sense of being connected to the rest of the country. But I think, you know, one of the big things which unites all of this and is that sense of national pride. So, you know, and that's what I think a lot of these reform voters want to have reflected back to them, in a sense, whether it is roads, whether it's jobs, whether it's, you know, steelworks and Scunthorpe. It's this sense of, actually, this is what our country is. And when we're looking at, you know, this brilliant report which Jamie's put together and spoken us through, the things that they see as pride, you know, is their white population falling? Does this feel like the way it felt 10 years ago? And there might be some of us in Westminster who feel uncomfortable having a conversation about that, but that is how it plays out locally. And then I think the third interesting thing is actually, you know, what Jamie was talking about right at the beginning is the kind of us versus them thing of populism. The big thing, reform, if you talk to anyone in reform at the moment, they will tell you we're professionalizing. And I don't know if anyone's ever seen Nigel Farage try to professionalize. He's written a couple of policy documents in his time, or at least signed his name to them, which have blown up quite rapidly. But I'm quite fascinated to see what happens if they actually do manage to do it. I'm slightly skeptical of quite how much they professionalize. There's a lot of places where they say, you know, we've got X number of volunteers and this, that, and the other, and we've got 400 branches set up across the country. A lot of those places, they are still actually having to bus in volunteers from London. But I'm really interested to see, you know, if people start to see reform as a more institutionalized party, does that change how they view them as this kind of like anger vote, I guess? Is it still an us versus them, or does reform actually start to become embedded within Westminster, so they're seen as part of Westminster as well?
Great. So I'm going to come to the audience in a minute. So if you have a question, if you can scroll down, and there should be a little box with a question in it that says Q&A. And if you just put your questions in there, then I'll come to you. But Sascha, I'm really interested in this question of whether you can tackle reform with policy, to what extent, and I think this whole process of professionalization of the idea that they're not just wanting to be a protest party, but they are going to start to come forward with policies. They even talked about the idea of having their own think tank, which we're certainly looking forward to engaging with. But I think, you know, there is still a question, because based on what Keiran was saying, it feels at least part of this is a sort of plague on all your houses approach to the big parties, and just a sort of rejection. But I think this question of, could it be about policy? And if it is about policy, what are those policies? And as you said, we saw a bit of that this week from Yvette Cooper on immigration. But do you think there are other policy areas where reform's viewpoint is starting to be taken seriously, where the Labour government or the Conservatives might start to move to mimic some of those policies?
I don't know that they would necessarily go to mimic some of those policies. I think what has been interesting is actually a couple of MPs saying to me on the steelworks and Scunthorpe of we're being outflanked by reform on the left, which is quite a weird experience for them. I do also think it's quite difficult to deal with the threat of reform through policy. I do not think that is the the people who vote reform are not thinking necessarily about the individual policies. They will be thinking, has Labour done anything to stop immigration, and what does that look like in my community? You know, they will be thinking, is there a migrant hotel in my community, and does that bother me, and does that make me feel worse? Is crime better or worse? So the answer is yes and no, in the sense of the mechanism for changing these things is through policy, but policy signals in themselves are not going to win people over.
Right. So we've got some questions coming in. So the way I'm going to do this is I'm going to ask the people who've posted the question if they want to ask, if they can ask the question directly. So we'll go to you and we'll unmute you and you can ask the question. Don't worry, your camera won't come on, so it's not going to be, there's no jeopardy of your camera coming on, but we'd like it if you can ask your question directly. And I think the first question we've got is around, the question around whether they're a single issue party from David Scott. David, let's see if this works. Are you there and are you able to ask your question?
I don't think you can hear me, can you?
We can hear you, yeah.
Oh, okay.
Do you want to go ahead and ask your question?
Yes, thank you. It's just whether, so with the UKIP party and Nigel Farage's previous parties, the Brexit seemed to change the vote for them. And I just wonder whether, if we did manage to stop the votes, whether that's really what the reform support is about, and if we could magically resolve that issue, whether their support might.
Thanks, David. So, Keiran, what do you think? Is immigration and stopping the votes, and particularly illegal immigration, is that a strong enough issue that it would change the direction?
So I think thank you for the question. I think when we look at different issues and ask which party is the strongest on the economy, the NHS, immigration, housing, etc., the one issue that reform wins on is immigration. And we know it is the number one issue for people that voted reform at the last election. And obviously, when we talk about immigration, that encompasses legal and legal immigration numbers and asylum and boats and things. It encompasses a wide variety of issues. You can almost call it borders in brackets. So I think that there is some truth to the idea that they're a single issue party at the moment. And one of the challenges that Farage and Reform have, I think, is to flesh out some policy offers on other things, which I think is why the sort of remarks about steel and nationalising steel were probably quite important, maybe a sign of things to come. Would fixing that issue make them go away? I mean, there is still this wider sense of Britain being in decline. More than 6 in 10 think Britain's in decline. A harking back for sort of nostalgia and sort of years gone by. That doesn't go away just because immigration as an issue sort of falls down the agenda. Similarly, the idea that the system is broken, that the economy doesn't work for people, doesn't go away either. I suppose that the real challenge is, to what extent do we really believe it is going to go away? I think that one thing the current government could do, if they could quote unquote stop the boats, that would be a major sort of blow for populism in the UK, because it takes away a lot of the oxygen around one of the key issues. Not in terms of the numbers of people entering the country, as we all know, but in terms of just the sort of visual it creates of the kind of perceived lack of control that government has over what's going on. So certainly, I think if Keir Starmer and Labour could make significant, meaningful progress on that, that would have that would be important. But then what that's not going to do is overnight suddenly make net legal migration into Britain become, hundreds of thousands lower than it has been. So, and even if that was the case, do reform voters believe that? And do they think that the changes that have happened in the last 10, 20 years, it's all too late, all too late. So I'm skeptical the issue I mean, probably the punchline would be, yes, I think that would make a significant impact, as would Nigel Farage himself not being there. I mean, another issue to think about is whether it's, to what extent reform is a bit of a one-man band. But I guess where I'm a bit skeptical is that issue could simply vanish.
Thanks, Keiran. Well, we've got a question on this topic of Farage from Alex Murdoch. Alex, I don't know if you're there, if you can ask your question directly.
Yes, can you hear me?
Yeah, we can hear you.
Yes, my view is whether, and I do research on populism, and my view is populism is often tied to a populist leader. And if you took away Farage in the same way in the States, if you took away Trump, would reform have a future without Farage? I personally doubt whether many people could name a reform member of parliament other than Nigel Farage.
So I think you're probably right that people can't name many other members of reform other than Farage. But and the rest of the panel may disagree with me on this, but I actually think that there may be a stronger future for reform post Farage potentially. The only reason why I say that is when I think you look at the examples of the European populist parties that have been very successful, it's often not the person that took them to the brink of popularity who then actually gets them into government. And you look at Giorgia Meloni in Italy. I think one of the challenges is you have to be the sort of protester, you have to be the oppositionist candidate to get there. But then when you want to be the actual be a serious candidate for government, I think that takes some different characteristics other than just being a protest party. So I think if reform want to be really successful, they would ultimately have to evolve from Farage, because I think, as Keiran said, one of the big negatives is he's quite divisive. But Sascha, Jamie, Keiran, how do you see Farage's influence on reform, and how significant is he to the reform project? Sascha, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's a really interesting point that you make actually about populist parties that have kind of outlived their original leader. And I do think that there is something in that. The transition to succession for the leader of reform, I think, would be quite difficult. But I do think it has more widespread appeal than just Nigel Farage, and I actually think reform is a more successul vehicle than UKIP, for example, because UKIP was really basically just built around Brexit. And, if you talk to people who've actually lost seats, so somewhere like Boston and Skegness, where Richard Tice won and is basically the closest thing that reform has to a safe seat, some of the Tory advisors who kind of worked on the campaign will say they effectively could have run a paper candidate in that seat and still won it. And it wasn't really about it. Like, it was from the moment that Nigel Farage said that he was going to run, they knew that seat was effectively going to go reform. So in a sense, that was about reform. But also there are these seats, and I do think this report kind of helps us look at them, where that support for a reform-like candidate is kind of built in and will be very difficult to fend off. Again, somewhere like Makerfield, which has one of the highest shares of reform vote, and has kind of gone, it's only ever been Labour and Tory. That is a real threat seat that could be won over by reform, with or without Nigel Farage, I think.
If I could just jump back in there, Theo, I think that a lot of this is going to depend on the future of the Conservative Party as well, right? And I think that it's probably one of the most resilient political parties in Western politics over time. Doesn't feel that way right now. But I think on Farage, I think one of the biggest challenges the Conservative Party have, whatever your view of Kemi Badenoch's leadership of the Tories, is just that Nigel Farage is such a big figure. I've talked about him being divisive. That's what the data shows, but he has his supporters. And I think the Conservatives are struggling, whoever their leader is at the moment, to have anybody that matches him in terms of his national sort of name recognition and status and so on. In a world where Nigel Farage isn't there and there's a new reform leader, then suddenly that advantage reform has over the Conservative Party does shift a bit. Now, of course, the Conservative Party have all sorts of other legacy issues around their brand and so forth, but it's not hard to imagine a situation where if Nigel Farage isn't there anymore, the Conservative Party either is as likely, if not more likely, to have a bigger profile nationally and a sort of bigger voice nationally than whoever that person might be. So I think the sort of somewhat unsatisfactory answer in a post-Farage world is does kind of depend on who that person is. But I think, I'm sort of reluctant to assume that the Conservative Party just stays languishing in the low 20s forever, until we wait for a sort of reform government. I think that for all of Farage's divisiveness that I've described, my suspicion is that reform exists with him and may not without him until such time as someone emerges that can take on that mantle.
He's been more flexible than I kind of expected. I thought maybe a year ago I sort of had a sense that there was a clear floor on reforms, a high floor on reform support because people just put their faith in Nigel Farage, but the ceiling was also quite low because of kind of his divisiveness. And I thought that if they'd have installed if they had a younger leader who was maybe more flexible economically, that they could have done better. And I thought Farage was sort of dyed in the wool, Thatcherite, and kind of it would be hard, and that was kind of a sort of a shield against reforms rise, because that economically they're not going to be as flexible as some of the other parties we've seen, say Trump and sort of and Vance, and kind of they're more sort of left-leaning economics. But Farage is showing more versatility, and it's kind of said with the steel industry and probably presumably in other areas that will come up, in the water. I think they were calling for water to be nationalised, taking some of those sort of wearing the left's clothing and going further left on some of these issues economically into sort of more classic sort of old Labour territory. And so I think he's and probably trying to present himself in a slightly more prime ministerial way. These kinds of things that I think will act to raise the ceiling as well. So I think there's more room for growth than I'd have thought maybe a year ago.
So thanks, Alex. It's a great question. We've got a question from Oliver White, which is about younger voters. Oliver, are you able to ask your question? Go ahead. We can't hear you, Oliver. I can ask your question for you, unless do you want to try again? Okay, so Oliver's question, I'll ask it for him, was there's been recent polls of younger British adults which have headlines that reform have a strong appeal for under 18 to 24-year-old men. To what extent do you think these findings are valid? So, yeah, we've seen a sort of media coverage sort of suggesting that the young are fash, as someone has put it. Do you think that there's credibility in this? Jamie, perhaps you first. Did you see anything in your data that suggests there is a correlation between reform vote share and younger voters, or male voters in particular?
Not at this point. My sense on this, I was speaking to sort of teachers, and that so Andrew Tate, was a really big deal 3-4 years ago, but he's kind of sort of waned in popularity. Seems like people are getting into sort of Nigel Farage sort of on TikTok or whatever. But is that kind of just sort of is it sort of a more passing countercultural sort of fad, or is it something that'll be more lasting? I mean, clearly that instinct has translated into support for Trump's America. Whether reform can capture that, I guess we'll sort of retain that. I guess we'll see.
Keiran?
Yeah, I'm open-minded on this issue, but I think in a nutshell, I would say I haven't seen as conclusive evidence for that as you have in the US. I think we should be careful about overly reading across some of the trends that we're seeing vis-a-vis Andrew Tate, Joe Rogan podcasts, and all these different things with Trump and here. But of course, we'll keep an eye on the data. I'm certainly not saying that anybody else's findings are invalid. I don't think there's conclusive evidence from the data that I've seen in that direction.
So, Sascha, what do you think? Are the younger generations suddenly becoming more fash, or is this just a sort of a bad media take?
I think so. I think the polling from YouGov that was quoted is an interesting one, and it's something that reform, internally will be very happy to tell you that their kind of age targets are basically between 18 and 25 and 40 to 70, which is always quite interesting to me. I do think that they are very good at captivating people's attention on things like TikTok, which is a primary driver of news. Nigel Farage is the single most popular politician on TikTok, and is literally hundreds of thousands of followers ahead of the next kind of British politician, who I think is Zara Sultana off the top of my head. And I think that's very interesting. But there is a difference, I think, between finding Nigel Farage entertaining and captivating on TikTok and potentially telling pollsters, you know what, yeah, I like this guy, and then actually putting that down in a ballot box. And I think the fact that these numbers haven't necessarily borne out after the general election is quite interesting. But Reform does have a way into the younger audience, and the main parties, you know, Labour and Tories, neither of them have managed to do this kind of social media captivation of younger audiences in the way that Reform does, and right-wing politicians have managed to do.
Yeah, I think this challenge of the battle for attention is a really crucial one in modern politics. And I think too often politicians assume that people listen to them, whereas the reality is it's just very hard to get any headspace with people, because and particularly now that the sort of compounding problem of people feeling politics isn't working, the world is getting worse, is actually they're turning off news more and more because it's so depressing to watch. So the window for a politician to reach voters is actually very small. And perhaps that's why we're seeing Ed Davey doing some quite eccentric but fun things to try and catch people's eye. We haven't talked so much about the Lib Dems, and so maybe that's what we can come back to. Thanks, Oliver, for the question. And next question is from Ben Shimshon. Ben, are you able to ask your question?
Hello. Yeah, can you hear me?
We can, yes.
Hi, great. So yeah, my question was, in terms of adopting reform policies, is it the panel's view that this is a fool's errand for the mainstream parties? Perhaps because you can only ever look like an echo of the real thing? Or do you think that making concessions on these topics, particularly immigration, I think, can actually peel voters away from reform who are not the sort of true believers, but who just want to see some of those views better catered for by the mainstream?
Yeah, who wants to take that one?
So I'll jump in. I mean, I think that it's possibly a bit of both. I suppose when you look at, let's take Labour's perspective as the governing party, to some extent, it's not just about winning over reform voters that have already voted reform. It's preventing voters that may have voted for you at the last general election from making that leap. And I suppose when I look at Labour Party voters from 2024 who are now unfavourable towards the party, it doesn't mean that they're not going to vote for them, just that they have a negative view of the party, then they are quite unlike Labour voters as a whole. They do put immigration in their sort of top three issues. So Labour voters as a whole from 2024 sort of notoriously don't prioritise immigration. They prioritise other issues like public services, the cost of living, poverty and inequality, and so on and so on and so on. But when you isolate that group of Labour voters that you could argue is vulnerable on the basis that they're unfavourable towards the party now, immigration is much more important. So my take on this is often that Labour needs an offer on immigration, and one can debate what that offer is, but it needs to have not have silence in response in a way that it felt like at times, this is much my personal opinion, it felt like at times the Democrats in the US at the most recent election really struggled to articulate what their actual response is. Now you're never going to out Farage, you're never going to out reform, but I still think you need that offer. At the same time, the macro Labour vote at the last general election, as I've alluded to, does prioritise public services and the cost of living and other issues like poverty and inequality. And so, if you're trying to keep your voting coalition together, then delivering for those voters on those key issues is going to be critical as well. So have an offer, but deliver on those core issues that matter most to your voters. And we've obviously just seen at the 2024 general election what happens if you don't do that, with the Conservative vote almost splitting in half from one election to the next on immigration, yes, but also on other issues too. So I don't think it's about being diet reform or anything like that, but I do think there needs to be an offer on those issues that motivate people. Otherwise, you might lose votes in that direction.
I think I think part of the problem that the Conservative have, and which drove a lot of those people into the arms reform, was that the Conservatives spoke so strong on immigration, since David Cameron years, and you look at the graph tells a very simple story about what happened to immigration, particularly after Brexit, and the Boris wave as kind of reform people talk about the high net migration sort of since then. So I think sort of reduce the salience of immigration as an issue. Labour needs to have policies on it, and they need to actually there need to be things which they're darn sure that can happen. But I do think, even if you sort of whack that mole, another mole will appear. I mean, reform is clearly making net zero and sort of anti-net zero a big part of their platform, and I think the parties of the centre can sort of get ahead of that by acknowledging. So I know Tony Blair's think tank put out today something about acknowledging those reforms. Britain is a small part of global emissions, and therefore that the government's policy should recognise that. And basically, this you can see some more of that narrative sort of be going into the government. And so I think thinking about how they frame net zero, how they talk about how they tackle it, will be part of it to basically try and see off that becoming the next big hill for sort of the populists to fight on, as it already is coming.
Sascha, what do you think?
Yeah, I think it's interesting. And I don't think by any stretch that Labour should basically rip off reform policies. I do think they should be looking at the kinds of things which motivate reform voters. And, we've talked a lot here today about immigration. The other big one is economic values and how that kind of plays out. And I think when Rachel Reeves and Keir Starmer came in, there was a bedded in sense of this is going to be a very difficult couple of years, because to get the kind of economic growth, which will mean that people see a difference in the money in their pocket, is going to take time. But I do think the narrative around it has not necessarily cut through particularly well to the kinds of voters that we're talking about here today. It's something that I've heard multiple MPs kind of laugh about the Oxford-Cambridge growth corridor, and you can't really imagine anyone kind of T Valley being like, oh God, thank God for that. That's really going to make me feel better off. And it's not to say that those things are bad things, but those are not things that make the kinds of people who would vote for reform feel like the Labour government in Westminster is speaking to them. And I think that's also part of the narrative. Someone said to me recently, Labour MPs back in the day could basically go to their constituencies on a Friday and talk about service delivery and what the government was doing for service delivery, and that was it. And that was kind of all they had to do to keep their constituents relatively happy. Now you're having to, and I said this at the beginning, I think what encompasses all of these issues really, whether it's the NHS, whether it's sewerage, whether it's net zero, it's this sense of actually national pride. And there is an element of a very complicated element of giving people a sense of hope to look forward to, but also reflecting back how crap they feel and how crap they have felt. And, MPs who lost a lot of voters to reform or lost seats to reform have said, I actually wish I did a little bit more of that on the doorstep in the run up to 2024. I wish I'd kind of said to them, I know that when you walk into the community or into the high street, it doesn't feel particularly nice. It's not dangerous necessarily, but you don't feel safe. I wish I'd reflect some of those concerns back to some of the voters, because they do actually want to hear that. And I think getting that combination right is very difficult.
Yeah, I think I would frame it. I do think policies can make a difference, and I don't think it's about mimicking reform. I think that the dividing line, as I would see it, is sort of between nostalgia for the past, which reform is heavy on, and actually having policies that are designed for the world as it is and for the future. And given it some specific examples of that, I think when reform, one of the things we know about reform from Jamie's data is that one of the key factors is low and no skilled workers. That's where they're a strong part of their vote is. I think the way that reform talks about that working class is as if they were still working in factories. There's still the sort of image through sort of rose-tinted glasses, and sometimes you get this in Labour as well, of mines, factories, pits, and those communities, and can we bring that back through reindustrialization? Whereas the reality is that set of voters who feel most disaffected, who are struggling with cost of living, who are low and no skill, and and aren't getting the opportunities that they want, they're working in the care sector. And so if you really wanted to design policies to go after after reforms vote, you'd probably focus on how do you improve social mobility for those people working in the care sector. And that might be a policy area that would more directly affect and improve their lives and feel that you're addressing their concerns, rather than pretending that we can bring back the factories and the mines from the 1970s and 80s and that vision of the working class that's long past. So thanks, Ben. A great question. I'm just going to give the panel one last question. And if anyone has a burning question online, do post it. But one thing that we haven't talked about, which I did want to just ask, is how do you see the Lib Dems and some of the other parties that we haven't mentioned, perhaps the Greens, the SNP, Plaid Cymru, how do you see them faring in the election ahead? Keiran, maybe I'll go to you first, and then Sascha and Jamie.
In the local elections and then the
Yeah.
mayoral and things. Yeah, I mean, I think that just by nature, there's obviously individual mayoral contests across the country, but and things like that. But by nature of what seats are up, I mean, I think that's 7 in 10 council seats being defended on Thursday are Tory council seats. So, you know, a lot. I suspect the story Friday morning will be a lot to do with reform. But do watch out for the Liberal Democrats, particularly in areas of the south of England and the southwest, and whether they can consolidate some of that support that they clearly gained at the general election. On the Greens, I know that the West of England mayoralty is one that they've got their eye on, conflicting polling information about their chances there. But I think that one of the things I'll be looking for is not just where those two parties take seats, but also where do they gain share versus Labour. And I think that one of the stories I suspect we will come to this Parliament is this idea of Labour being vulnerable on their left flank. You know, our data shows that around 1 in 3 Labour voters from 2024 have favourable opinions of both the Greens and the Liberal Democrats. And I think that that is the balancing act any governing party has between being attacked from the right, Reform, and the left, if you want to call it that, the Greens and Lib Dems. So, yeah, I'm sort of looking at share. I don't suspect that either of those two parties, though, will be the main story in terms of seat gains and things of that nature, just because of the nature of the seats that are up. But that doesn't mean that we can't learn something from, you know, where they do gain seats or where they do or where their vote share does increase, and also, you know, if there is any high-profile mayoralties that they take.
So the left fighting back might be an interesting subplot beyond the headlines that we see later this week. Sascha, how do you think that the Lib Dems are feeling about these locals, and what do you think is going to happen?
I mean, Lib Dems are built for local elections, but I do think what will be interesting, because I think Keiran is right in that the story coming out of it will be reform, but actually interesting to see how the Lib Dems pivot their messaging and have already started to pivot their kind of messaging, which has always been hyper localized. You know, something we've seen the last couple of months is the Lib Dems going weirdly international and saying, you know, we're the anti-Trump party or things like that. We would never do a deal with Donald Trump, when, you know, which I found quite strange, because to me that's very counterintuitive for the Lib Dems, who always do so well campaigning on bin collections and kind of potholes and things like that. I think what's also interesting is, you know, and Jamie talks about this, in the Southwest there was quite low reform support, where the Lib Dems are generally expected to do well. I'm curious to see how, you know, in the next year or so, how that, not necessarily in the local elections, how that pans out in terms of farmers who perhaps feel that the inheritance tax is a really big thing for them, and the Lib Dems aren't necessarily the people to take that fight on for them.
Thanks, Sascha. Jamie, what do you think? You've seen some resistance in the Southwest?
Yeah, absolutely. And so I think, you know, looking at the models, looking at the seats where the Liberal Democrats ended up winning, whether those seats were in the Southwest or whether they were outside of the Southwest, the Reform did worse in almost every single one of them. So there is something about those seats that the Lib Dems happen to be strong in, where Reform, you know, given the economic factors, the demographic factors of those areas, Reform underperforms. So whether that's some magic, or whether they're sort of fishing in a sense in a similar pool, speaking to people who have, you know, spent a lot of time in sort of Reform, going to local meetings, this kind of thing, they describe it as basically feeling quite a lot like Lib Dem meetings, sort of Lib Dems that really care about immigration in sort of a let's reduce it please kind of way, but they're being quite, you know, as Sascha said, sort of whether that's the localism side, but just this kind of an atmosphere. So I think there's some interesting things, that kind of sort of instinctive anti the big two parties. They've got that in common, but there are other things which they have there, and which might mean that the Lib Dems have a particular strength in being able to combat that.
Great. So thanks. We're out of time. So I want to say thanks to all of our panelists. Thanks to Jamie, Keiran, and Sascha. Thanks to all of you for tuning in and for asking questions. And we'll stay tuned, and we'll see what happens on Thursday. And then we're looking forward to giving an update on our work as we make further progress. So thanks very much, and enjoy the rest of your day.